And one of the things that I said was that communion was a misinterpretation, right? And where does this come from? This comes from, well, two passages. It comes from Romans, 1 Corinthians, 11, and also Luke 22, right? Yeshua says, do this in remembrance of me. The church then took that, and I made the comment that they made something that was not prescribed in the Bible, which is communion, the celebration of communion, and that this was just a misinterpretation. And so we had some people say, what are you talking about? Another person accused me of being anti-church. And so, well, Brian and Jamie, that's the name of the YouTube channel that commented on our YouTube page. They said, not disagreeing, but how about some support for this claim? And that's in regards to the communion not being in the Bible. Okay, well, actually, I think it actually has to go the other way. So in other words, I obviously have been studying the Eucharist and communion quite a bit, and I understand that some people would say, so for instance, Joachim Jeremias, is that how you say his name? Joachim Jeremias? Anyway, he wrote a standard book.
I think it's probably silent J, but that's all right.
Well, Petrie says Joachim.
Yeah, that's right.
Here's the book. It's called The Eucharistic Words of Jesus. It is by far a standard within Eucharistic studies. Anyway, he says that as soon as the ascension happens, they go back in Acts, right, and they're breaking bread. And he says that the breaking of bread is they're carrying on the communion now. This has been strongly opposed, and for good reason. I think that this is basically nonsense. No offense to Jeremias and his scholarship, but basically it's talking about eating a meal together. Now, there's been good scholarship since then that has greatly opposed this and shown that if there was a Eucharist or a communion in the early church, it was in a meal form. It wasn't a communion or anything like that up until much later. And maybe even the 3rd century is when it starts to move to more of a communion type thing. And so, really, then you have the
Caleb, if I may just say something. We know that if you even come from let's say a Protestant tradition,
right?
You look at what the Catholic Mass is, and you go, okay, that's not what's in the Bible, right? I mean, the Protestants will say that's not what's in the Bible, but the degree of alteration of what the Catholic Mass is depending on how, right, there's a matter of degree. Some look kind of like it, but they reword it, and then some get further and further away from it until you have, everybody has a little cup of juice and a little teeny cracker, kind of thing.
Well,
but the idea is, I don't think anyone's going to argue that what this Lord's Supper looks like, or whatever you want to call it, 1 Corinthians 11, is that it throughout the history of the church, it's meant different things to different groups. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. Do you think anybody out there is saying, no, it's clear church history has a strong history,
yes,
we know what it is?
I think that people say, well, there was someone who specifically said, you're going against 2,000 years of church history. But this is not a very strong argument for multiple reasons.
Of what church? Like which?
Not only what church, but okay, the Didache, people will argue that the Didache has the beginnings of the communion because the word Eucharistos is used in chapter 10. This can strongly be debated and opposed, and it is by good Didache scholars. We don't really start to see any form of or even mention of a Eucharist. We'll talk about 1 Corinthians in just a second, until about 150. 150 to 200 is when we really start to see the idea of a Eucharist and this ceremony that starts to be implemented. So basically what people are saying is that Jesus, Yeshua, in Luke 22 and in 1 Corinthians 11, when he says, do this in remembrance of me, he's talking about something that the disciples didn't celebrate and wasn't celebrated until almost over 100 years, 120 years after Yeshua died and ascended. So that's number one. Number two, in the context of when Yeshua is speaking, it is a Passover meal. And I like to give this analogy. If grandpa is dying and the modern Christian church, obviously the family's sitting around the Christmas tree on Christmas morning, and they're sipping eggnog as they have every Christmas morning for, years past. And they open presents, and grandpa gets his sweater or whatever, and he leans back knowing this is going to be his last Christmas with the family. And he says, I hope you guys do this in remembrance of me. Is he talking about creating a completely new celebration? No, of course not. He's talking about the celebration that's going on right there and then. And the same thing happens in the Last Supper. Yeshua is eating the Passover. He's having the Passover with his disciples. He says, do this in remembrance of me. And we're supposed to assume that 120 years later, a celebration that is then instated by the church is more weighty than what is going on in the Gospels. I don't buy it. Beyond that, I don't think that the church has the ability to overrule the apostles and Yeshua himself. And so this idea of church history, 2,000 years of church history. Well, transubstantiation came into the communion service very early, right? And the idea of communion changed quite a bit. Transubstantiation was held all the way up until the Reformation. Now, the other problem with saying, 2,000 years of church history, what church history? If people would have said that to Luther or to Calvin, you can't go against the church, then we wouldn't have the Reformation. The idea that Protestants say, 2,000 years of church history is ridiculous, because you're basically fighting against your own Reformation. What has happened with the Reformation is people have said, no, the church doesn't have the power to overrule what the Scripture says. So really, the proof is not for me to produce. The proof is for others to prove that the text in which Yeshua is speaking, he's instituting something new, which I think is impossible from the text. The text that people will go to is 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is, you're going to have troubles in 1 Corinthians, though. And the reason why is because Paul continues to talk about Passover throughout the letter, right? In 5, 6 through 8, he says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So he's talking about Passover. He says celebrate the festival. Are we to assume that he's talking about a new celebration? And then, of course, in 11:23 through 29 is when people really, this is where they say the communion was instituted. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Yeshua in the night which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, the cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it, or as you do it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever, yada, yada, yada. So this is where they say that the communion, it comes from. Once again, I believe that he's talking about Passover. And I think that there's good evidence towards that as well. Don't miss any clips from Messiah Matters by clicking the subscribe button. Also, give this video a thumbs up and share it so other people can see it too.